Hello and a warm welcome to our film on the history and character of Dickens's classic A Christmas Carol. We've called it a study guide also because we hope that quite a lot of what I'm going to be exploring will be of use and interest to all students who might be studying A Christmas Carol as a set text. I say we because this is also sponsored by the Dickens Fellowship, so it's a kind of joint enterprise. And just before we start exploring Christmas Carol itself, I'd like to do a couple of introductions. The first one is to the Dickens Fellowship itself. The Dickens Fellowship is an organisation that was founded in 1902, and its aim was to bring into fellowship all admirers of Dickens. And 1902, it was only just over 30 years after Dickens himself died. So one of the first presidents of the Dickens Fellowship was one of Dickens's sons. So the fellowship has always had this close relationship with the Dickens family, and in fact our current president of the fellowship is Dickens's great-great-great-granddaughter, Lucinda Hawksley. So we keep this connection with the Dickens family. The fellowship isn't quite the same as a literary society. Its emphasis is very much on fellowship. And I've spelt out there some of the aims of the fellowship, and you'll see that it is very much an aim to keep a kind of corporate, almost a family identity, the sense of a community of people who really admire and want to explore further Dickens's work and indeed Dickens's life. And so this film really arises out of those fellowship aims, and we hope it's going to be useful. The second introduction is to myself, since I've suggested down at the bottom there that if after you've watched the film you've got any questions, thoughts about the film, but about also Dickens and Christmas Carol, Dickens's work more generally, Dickens's life, the fellowship would like to hear from you. And there is a kind of question section on the fellowship's website. And given that I will probably be one of the people answering some of these questions if you put them through to us, I feel I ought to say something about myself. I've been a teacher at the University of Kent for many, many years, taught courses on Dickens, and also been a member of the Dickens Fellowship for many, many years. Over here is the cover for the Journal of the Dickens Fellowship, a journal which I edited for about 30 years. And I've had this interest in Dickens, the life of Dickens and his career as a writer for a long time, but particularly two aspects. One is Dickens's championship of children and childhood in his works and in his journalism. And also, I've been interested in Dickens's extraordinary career as a professional public reader of his works. And both these interests will feature as part of our exploration of Christmas Carol. But anyway, let me go to a route map to show you what I want to explore in this. The first one is the background and motivation for Dickens's writing of A Christmas Carol. The second part goes on to consider the literary character of the carol, the sorts of techniques that Dickens uses for what I've called his activist purposes. And the third part is really the question, can literature change people's minds? Because that is what Dickens was after in A Christmas Carol. So we go to the first part. How and why did Dickens come to write A Christmas Carol? March 1843. The Christmas Carol was published in December of that year. But in March, Dickens was sent a copy of the report by a government commission on the physical and moral conditions of children working in the mines and factories. And this report carried illustrations of children some as young as 6, who were harnessed to coal carts deep underground, dragging them along dark, narrow tunnels all day long. Children were particularly useful down in the mines because they were so small. The tunnels were very narrow, and children could squeeze down into them, get the harness on, and start dragging these coal carts up to the base of the shaft. The report and its illustrations brought these dreadful conditions up from underground and exposed them to the nation's attention. And they also reported on children working in the factories. It was both the physical conditions and the moral circumstances of very young children working in these concerns. Dickens read the copy, was absolutely horrified, and wrote back to the friend who had sent him the parliamentary report, "I'm so perfectly stricken down by the report you sent me that I think of writing and bringing out a very cheap pamphlet called An Appeal to the People of England on behalf of the Poor Man's Child, with my name attached, of course." Because by this time, 1840s, Dickens was already a national celebrity, so his name had force. However, 4 days later, Dickens had changed his mind and wrote again to his friend, "Don't be frightened when I tell you that since I wrote to you last, reasons have presented themselves for deferring the production of that pamphlet until the end of the year. I'm not at liberty to explain them further just now, but rest assured that when you know them and see what I do and where and how, you will certainly feel that a sledgehammer has come down with 20 times the force, 20,000 times the force I could exert by following out my first idea." A mysterious change, but Dickens obviously had huge confidence. A sledgehammer blow this was going to be. What Dickens read and saw in that dreadful publication was just one example of very widespread misery among the poorer working classes in England, in Britain at this time. Overcrowded slum housing and contaminated water. It's not just the mines and factories, the domestic living conditions of people was appalling. The 1840s in England came to be known later as the Hungry 40s, because it was a time of very great hardship for the poor, and especially helpless children of the poor, a time of great social unrest, terrible cholera epidemic and terrible food shortages. And these are reflected in some of the smaller illustrations in the original edition of A Christmas Carol. You can see John Leech's woodcuts down there on either side of this horrific picture of an overcrowded slum lodging house with contaminated water down at the bottom. So these are from The Christmas Carol. The two children, ignorance and want, confronting Scrooge there. In the summer of 1843, and this is 4 months after Dickens has seen that parliamentary report, the satirical magazine Punch published a cartoon called Capital and Labour, and it satirised the widening gulf between the wealthy and the poor and the capitalist exploitation of the labour of the poor. 2 years later, a novelist and a very energetic politician with strong sympathies for the working class published a novel called Sybil with the title The Two Nations. And the author was Benjamin Disraeli, later Prime Minister. And here's an extract I put up there on the left. It's a conversation between two characters in this novel, and I put it side by side with the Punch cartoon. The dialogue goes as follows. "Say what you like," says one. "Our Queen reigns over the greatest nation that ever existed." "Which nation?" asked the younger stranger. "For she reigns over two nations who are as ignorant of each other's habits, thoughts and feelings as if they were dwellers in different zones or inhabitants of different planets, who are formed by a different breeding, are fed by different food, are ordered by different manners, and are not governed by the same laws." Note these lines here. These are the coal mine tunnels and the children dragging carts. So Punch has obviously taken illustrations from that report that so horrified Dickens and embedded them into the lower part of this cartoon drawing. And down here is this world of pain and misery, bleached out in the cartoon and locked underground so that it won't disturb the comfort and serenity of the capitalists whose wealth is generated precisely by the crippling labour and poverty we see below. So this was a period, the 1840s, with a rush of cartoons and pamphlets on the condition of England, and that's probably why Dickens first thought of a pamphlet, almost instinctively thought a pamphlet. He would join the group of people issuing these pamphlets. His pamphlet was called, or was to have been called, An Appeal to the People of England on Behalf of the Poor Man's Child. Well, as he's indicated, that never appeared. Instead, A Christmas Carol was published on the 19th of December 1843. At the heart of that story was the figure of the poor man's child, Tiny Tim. So here is how some of Dickens's key characters might be fitted in to the cartoon scheme. Scrooge up here, insulated from the working world down there. Of course, Scrooge doesn't luxuriate in the wealth of these people, but he is a miserly, separate, misanthropic figure who wants to keep all of this at a distance. And then down here, the suffering poor, Bob Cratchit with Tiny Tim on his shoulder, and the figures of ignorance and want. Scrooge has only an impersonal financial relationship with his clerk and with society as a whole, but by the end, he's replaced that with a heartfelt, paternal and familial relationship. So he becomes a humane employer to his poor clerk and a second father to the poor man's child, Tiny Tim. So that's what happened. Now, the question is, why did Dickens change his mind? Two parts to this. First of all, why did he write a story instead of publishing a political pamphlet? Secondly, why did he delay his story until Christmas time? First of all, why a story? If Dickens had wanted so much to make changes to people's lives, why didn't he go into politics, like Disraeli? Dickens was asked this quite often, and his answer from one letter is as follows. As to Parliament, I have often been invited to go there, but I believe I am more useful in my present place than I could ever be there. Dickens had no respect for Parliament anyway. He thought it was simply a talking shop full of overblown hypocrites. Dickens believed very strongly in the power of imaginative literature to bring about social and political change. He claimed he had always systematically tried to turn fiction to the good account of showing the preventable wretchedness and misery in which the mass of the people dwell. And he's quite right, because in his journalism and in his fiction, and sometimes there's a peculiar merging of the campaigning journalist and the novelist. For example, in Oliver Twist, the famous illustration down there, Oliver Twist asking for more in the workhouse. Dickens used both his journalism and his fiction in order to campaign for changing conditions. Hence the activist in the subtitle for this talk. So I'm going to come back to this issue of the power of storytelling, the power of creating an imaginary world to help change people's hearts and minds. The second question, why did Dickens postpone it till Christmas? He could have written a story, obviously not a Christmas story, instead of a pamphlet during the spring or summer, but he waited until Christmas. Why? Well, Christmas time conventionally is a time for transformation and renewal, conventionally and traditionally. I want to spend a little bit of time trying to illustrate this. The English Christmas festival was founded upon ancient pre-Christian transformation festivals around the turn of the year, around the time of the winter solstice, the end of the old year, the beginning of the new one. And the English Christmas typically keeps many traces of the old pagan celebrations of transformation and renewal. Look, for example, at the transformations that happen to Scrooge's rooms when the ghost of Christmas present arrives, and how Dickens and his illustrator, John Leach, draw upon these ancient forms of celebrations to take the Christmas festival. The important thing for Dickens was also to take the Christmas festival beyond the immediate Christian context, to open it out, and hence he draws in all the old pagan, medieval associations with Christmas. This is the text from the carol. It was his own room, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe and ivy reflected back the light. All of these motifs here belong to Christmas. It looked a perfect grove. Well, traditionally, ancient druids, pagan forms of worship, took place in oak groves, and they crowned themselves with leaves of holly or ivy. So holly, ivy and mistletoe have always been a part of the Christmas. And holly, mistletoe, was popularly known as oak sperm because of the berries there, and it was regarded as a fertility symbol and was celebrated as such. And so we have now the ceremony, the superstition of kissing under the mistletoe as a faint memory of that old fertility ritual. On the left, such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney, and seething bowls of punch that made the chamber dim with their delicious steam. Well, Dickens has brought into Scrooge's room not only the greenery, but also some of the old German and Scandinavian motifs of Christmas. The Yule log, which was brought in to burn on the hearth as the old year died and the new year began and the sun's warmth returned. And also the wassail bowl. The figure down there is carrying a bowl of wassail, this spiced ale or cider, whatever it might be. And that's replicated in the seething bowls of punch that the giant ghost of Christmas present has brought into Scrooge's chamber. So there are transformations everywhere here. Living greenery in the grim, lifeless city room, blazing firelight and heath in Scrooge's hearth, and joyous punch and piles of food around the throne on which the ghost is sitting, instead of Scrooge's meagre bowl of gruel. One of the most famous midwinter festivals in ancient Rome was the Saturnalia. This was a holiday of feasting and dancing. Two aspects of the Saturnalia have curiously corresponding developments in A Christmas Carol. First of all, the Saturnalia celebrated the winter solstice and welcomed the return of the sun. And A Christmas Carol opens in fog and cold and darkness and finishes with bright, shining, golden sunlight. It's a kind of miniaturized version of that celebration of the return of the sun. Another tradition in the Saturnalia, which is of interest, is the reversal of normal hierarchies. The masters waited on their slaves at a table in ancient Rome during this festival. In the carol, Scrooge begins as a tyrannical employer and ends serving his clerk a bowl of punch. One other transformation involves the dissolving of differences. And this is not so much from pagan times, but what Dickens particularly wants to bring into the festival. And that is a dissolving of differences, a dissolving of class differences, particularly the two nations coming together as one, and then on the smaller family level, the dissolving of generations. Christmas was a time when adults traditionally join in fun and games with children. And this happens in stave 3 of A Christmas Carol at the party scene at Scrooge's nephew, where everyone joins in the games of forfeits and blind man's buff. It is good to be children sometimes, there, says the narrator, and never better than at Christmas. because that's when Jesus was a child. It is good to be children sometimes, says the narrator, and never better than at Christmas. And Leach has followed this in curious ways. Notice how he models his adults as rather childlike creatures, almost doll-like. And that is part of this dissolving of the differences between the generations. So the important thing that comes out of that is that for Dickens, Christmas is a time for rejuvenation, literally and figuratively, a time when grown-ups can be young and playful again. It may take a few drinks to persuade the adults into that mode, but that is the spirit behind it. Everybody belongs together with children. In the final stave on Christmas Day, Scrooge's own transformation is seen in terms of his rejuvenation. And he cries, "I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm quite a baby. Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby." So in all of these ways, Dickens, by grafting what had been his appeal pamphlet mission onto Christmas, delaying it until the Christmas time, takes advantage of a traditionally propitious time for benign transformations and renewals. And that, I'm sure, is why he decided to postpone the pamphlet idea. The other Christmas significance highlighted in the Pickwick passage, this Pickwick passage here, is the importance of the family community coming together. How many families whose members have been dispersed and scattered far and wide in the restless struggles of life are then reunited and meet once again in that happy state of companionship and goodwill. A close family is ideally the model for the national community, where the rulers, according to Dickens, should be able to exercise a kind of benign parental care over the people. And Christmas is the prime time to be considering such social and moral priorities. In the first stave, the charity collectors come into Scrooge's office and explain why they're choosing Christmas, in some ways rather like Dickens choosing Christmas for his appeal on behalf of the poor man's child. And the charity collectors tell Scrooge, "We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices." So Dickens chose to bring his altered pamphlet appeal idea close to Christmas time, when he could take full advantage of the associations with family, festivity, rejuvenation and charity. Those four things. Coincidentally, most of these associations with Christmas were brought together in the first commercially produced Christmas card, published in 1843, exactly the same year as the Christmas Carol. In the centre is a family group, sipping wine. It did offend the temperance groups in England at the time, who complained that children shouldn't be seen being given sips of wine. And in fact, nor should the family be drinking wine together. And then either side, illustrations of charitable activity, the poor being clothed and fed by the charity exercised by the kind of bit warm, benevolent feelings generated by Christmas in the family centre. Let me put that together with the other images that we've been looking at. The Punch cartoon, Capital and Labour, separated with a barrier, the two nations there, slowly in the Christmas card being brought closer and closer together. And then the illustrations chosen for the Christmas Carol, in many ways echoing the Christmas card itself. You've got the colour portrait of Fezziwig's Ball in the centre, family community, echoing the colour portrait of the family in the Christmas card, and then in rather bleached out tones on either side of that core, the heart of Christmas, are scenes of the poor. So these are the reasons why Dickens changed his mind. to graft his story onto Christmas time. Let's go to the next section, writing A Christmas Carol. This is Dickens, the familiar image of Dickens, and this is a close-up of the first edition of Christmas Carol. These are very small books. Dickens wrote 5 Christmas books, and they were quite expensively produced. This isn't a copy of A Christmas Carol, but it's identical. It's his last Christmas book called The Haunted Man. They were expensive productions. But we need to get to know the man who wrote Christmas Carol, the figure on the left, except that that isn't the man who wrote A Christmas Carol. This is the man who wrote A Christmas Carol. Very different figure. Not the bearded, elderly, eminent Victorian, but the young Dickens, 31 years old when he wrote Christmas Carol. Young man of very high energy and magnetic personality. Young man who, he describes the way that he wrote Christmas Carol. He wept and laughed and wept again and excited himself in the most extraordinary manner in the composition of the carol. He was so excited by it that he walked about the black streets of London 15 and 20 miles many a night when all the sober folks had gone to bed. So this is the young man who was so outraged by children working in the mines that he jumped at the idea of writing a campaigning pamphlet and then suddenly changed his mind in favour of A Christmas Story. So a dynamic personality, and already by this time an international celebrity. The Christmas Carol, which is now a venerable classic and indeed a set book, really was a young man's book, full of energy and colour and fun and indignation at social wrongs, and driven by this very powerful urge to set things right. As one of Dickens's friends remarked, Dickens projected his own characteristics onto the figure of Scrooge's nephew, Fred, who arrives in Scrooge's wintry office, full of warmth and energy and high spirit, radiating this dynamic warmth, and delivers at that point the core Christmas message to his grumpy old uncle. Given the identification of Scrooge's nephew with the young Dickens himself, who better to read to us the nephew's Christmas message than another young Dickens? And this is Ollie Dickens, the great-great-great-grandson of Charles. Ollie is in his early 30s, and so is almost exactly the age of Charles Dickens when he wrote A Christmas Carol in 1843. So let us hear Ollie Dickens read the passage from Stave 1 where nephew Fred greets his uncle Scrooge.
"A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried the cheerful voice of Scrooge's nephew. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" "Christmas? A humbug, Uncle? You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do." "Out on Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. He should! Uncle, nephew, keep Christmas in your way. Let me keep it in mine." "Keep it? But you don't keep it." "Ugh, let me leave it alone, then. Much good has it ever done you, much good may it ever do you." "There are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited. I dare say Christmas among the rest. But I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything could be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open up their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow travellers to the grave, and not just another race of other creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say God bless it.
Behind Dickens there is the facsimile of the original manuscript of The Christmas Carol. Marley was dead. And we're thinking about Dickens at work, feverish work on this manuscript. Let's stay with the manuscript for a little while. He was working so fast and often had to go back and add afterthoughts. And one amusing example has to do with Dickens choosing names. And here you can see the first time in the manuscript that he introduces Tiny Tim, except that Tiny Tim was originally going to be called Tiny Fred. So he scrubs out Fred and puts Tim there because he has another character that he's going to call Fred. I want to go back to the nephew's speech. Here it is with the illustration of the nephew cajoling Scrooge and trying to get him to share in the Christmas spirit. I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time, says the nephew when it's come round, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time, a kind, forgiving, charitable kind, and so on. The heart of the carol's message, more or less, is contained by the nephew's speech here. And that is the aim to bridge these two nations, as Disraeli called England at that time, to help to open the shut-up hearts of the rich and powerful so as to restore the nation to something like a single family community. But what I want you to notice is this parenthesis, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that. By being made into a bracket or a parenthesis, that very short passage does in effect stand apart from and subordinate to the long main sentence. So by making that statement into a parenthesis, Dickens can allude to the religious Christian Christmas message and festival, but tuck that into the margin, as it were, before going on to deliver what for him is the key value, secular value, not a religious value, to be associated with Christmas, the promotion of love and sympathy and charity. Think of that Christmas card. And promoting these to all of those who might not feel so strongly about Christmas's celebration of the birth of Jesus, taking it beyond that community, that constituency, as it were. And the manuscript allows us to track Dickens's mind here in the actual writing of the nephew's speech. We can see in the manuscript that the parenthesis, that is apart from, etc., etc., was an afterthought. You look at the highlighted section here, where Dickens has squeezed in extra text between his original lines because he suddenly thought, oops, I really ought to mention the Christian religious meaning of Christmas. It's a small detail, seems a finicky detail, but it's actually a significant point. Dickens parks the religious association there out of the way near the start of the nephew's speech because he wants to extend the moral message of Christmas beyond any specific religious context of the day. I mean, the poor are poor all the year round, after all. So the carol's key message, delivered by the nephew, must override all of those difficult differences of religious belief, Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, and so on, that were proliferating in early Victorian England. So the Christmas Carol could then function as a kind of secular Bible. It's often been called a secular Bible for the British. And some, however, felt that Dickens's pitch for the association with Christmas had failed precisely because he had ignored the religious message. Ruskin's comment here. Ruskin, a famous art critic of the time. His Christmas Dickens's Christmas meant mistletoe and pudding, neither resurrection from the dead, nor rising of new stars, nor teaching of wise men, nor shepherds. Dickens has left out everything that was really important to Ruskin for Christmas. But there are counter voices in this criticism. Dickens's overriding of religious differences meant that his book really had achieved a wider audience, and two very prominent Victorians bore witness to that. One was Francis Jeffrey, the distinguished literary critic and judge, who wrote personally to Dickens, "Blessings on your kind heart, you may be sure you have done more good and prompted more positive acts of beneficence by this little publication than can be traced to all the pulpits and confessionals in Christendom since Christmas 1842. And very generously, Thackeray, Dickens's great rival novelist, paid a handsome tribute to what he felt Dickens had done for the whole nation. "It seems to me," he said, "a national benefit, and to every man or woman who reads it, a personal kindness." Part 2, we're going to consider what kind of a story A Christmas Carol is. In other words, the literary character of the Dickens's book. What are the techniques that Dickens uses to engage the reader's mental and emotional attention and thereby achieve his activist agenda, his urge to change people's hearts? The Christmas Carol draws on the old tradition of telling ghost stories around the Christmas fire, and that's partly why Dickens decided to postpone his pamphlet appeal idea. Here's Dickens's preface to the carol. "I have endeavoured in this ghostly little book to raise the ghost of an idea which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly and no one wish to lay it." So we need to think of the Christmas Carol as designed for live storytelling around a fire with family and friends, not as a solemn literary classic that has become a set book. And that way you'll recover some of Dickens's original ideas of how he wanted to pitch it, and very importantly, the relationship that he wanted to establish with his readers. And we have some indication of this with Dickens in action, as it were. He used to give live reading performances of A Christmas Carol and extracts from his other books at venues all around Britain and in the United States over the last 12 years of his career. And he was reading to audiences of 1,000 or more in some of the larger halls, and without a microphone. An extraordinary achievement. Before he began, that is when he's reading Christmas Carol, he would say to his audience that he hoped they would think of themselves like a small group of friends listening to a tale told by a winter fire. Small group of friends sitting round a fire on a winter evening telling ghost stories or listening to a ghost story. This to 1,500 people. Importantly, Dickens also encouraged them explicitly to feel free to laugh or cry as they responded to the story. And he said, "It won't disturb me at all. In fact, I would like to hear it." So Dickens worked very hard to get rid of formalities and to bring everyone into a shared community of feeling. It had stopped being a book on those occasions. It became a kind of living communion between Dickens and his vast audience, most of whom had already read A Christmas Carol anyway. To engineer that feeling of very intimate sharing, Dickens devised a storyteller persona with a personality to encourage that relationship, precisely to encourage that relationship. He worked very hard on getting the right voice for the narrator, the right tone, the right manner. And that narrator is very keen to break through any formality right from the start. And he'll begin the whole book, he'll begin the book and the performance by teasing us out of our comfort zone. I'm to have the pleasure of reading to you tonight A Christmas Carol, being a ghost story of Christmas. Marley was dead. to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind you, I don't know what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to think a coffin nail is the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but yeah. There is no doubt that Marley was dead, and this must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm going to relate. I mean, if we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there'd be nothing more remarkable in his taking a nightly stroll upon his own ramparts than there would be in any other middle-aged man rashly turning out after dark in a breezy spot, literally to astonish his son's weak mind. And so Dickens rolls on, and you keep thinking that you're coming to the beginning of the story, and at a certain point you've got to get to this once upon a time. He's introduced the story, he's composed the listeners, and then he discomposes them, he disorients them, makes them sit up and think, what on earth is going on? Where is this person going? And the whole point is that Dickens wants very much to establish the presence and the character of his narrator, because it's this companion narrator who is going to be right by our side throughout the story. And his presence, that sort of intimate, urgent presence, is very much a part of the story. In a way, he's the first character in A Christmas Carol. So 2 or 3 pages go by before Dickens finally arrives at once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and so on. The narrator is wanting to establish himself as our companion, and as the story grows, he will in effect confront us as well as Scrooge with scenes of pathos and horror, as well as scenes of communal jollity, as in the Fezziwig Ball and so on. And he'll urge us to respond emotionally. So in some ways, Scrooge's relationship with the missionary ghosts, as they come one by one, is a version of the relationship we, the readers, have with our guide, the storyteller. He's conducting us in much the same way as the ghosts are conducting Scrooge. And this narrator will be a constant presence, and he emphasises this on so many occasions through the story. For instance, when Scrooge is first confronted by that strange figure, the ghost of Christmas past, the description is as follows. Scrooge, sitting up in bed, quote, found himself face to face with the unearthly visitor, as close to it as I am now to you, and I am standing in the spirit at your elbow. And that's the narrator, constantly reminding us that he's right by us. And he stays by our elbow throughout the story, sometimes telling us how much he'd like to dive into the scenes he's describing as though they were real live events. One example is the dancing party, where the narrator is very clear that he fancies the young girls, the pretty young girls in the party. And as an aside, he said, what would I not have given to be one of them? I should have dearly liked, I own, to have touched her lips, to be one of the young men there. I would dearly like, I own, to have touched her lips, to look upon the lashes of her downcast eyes and never raised a blush. So the narrator, this narrator is a very powerful presence in the story, energizing its action and criticising and amplifying its characters, teasing and nudging us, the readers, and doing everything he can to stir up our emotions directly as well as indirectly as we follow the experience of Scrooge. And he really wants to infect us, readers, with the turbulence of the story. As he says of laughter at one point, there is nothing in the world so irresistibly contagious as laughter and good humour. Dickens himself we know from some of his family records, used to do this kind of stirring up in his real life, infecting others with his own energies. I'll give you one example. Here's his daughter's memories of her father at dancing parties. His dancing was at its best, I think, in the Sir Roger de Coverley dance, and that's the dance that you may remember takes place at the Fezziwig Ball, and in what are known as country dances. This is the daughter writing. In the former, while the end couples are dancing and the side couples are supposed to be still, my father would insist upon the sides keeping up a kind of jig step and clapping his hands to add to the fun and dancing at the backs of those whose enthusiasm he thought needed rousing, as he himself was never still for a moment until the dance was over. So you can imagine, or you can hear Dickens sort of clapping at the back of the narrative of A Christmas Carol in order to keep our energetic engagement up throughout the story. Now we go on to the question of the carol's genre and mode as a literary production. What kind of a story is the carol? How did Dickens himself describe the carol's genre and mode? About 10 years after publishing the carol, Dickens brought out all 5 Christmas books in a single volume at a cheap price. And for this he wrote another and special preface. The narrow space within which it was necessary to confine these Christmas stories when they were originally published rendered their construction a matter of some difficulty and almost necessitated what is peculiar in their machinery. I could not attempt great elaboration of detail in the working out of character within such limits. My chief purpose was, in a whimsical kind of masque, which the good humour of the season justified, to awaken some loving and forbearing thoughts never out of season in a Christian land. So Dickens is asking us to think of the carol not as a compressed novel or novella or short story or any of those more prosaic kinds of productions, but as a whimsical kind of masque, M-A-S-Q-U-E, where characters are not developed with psychological realism, but function more as allegorical figures. And I want to pick up on some of these terms. A masque refers to an old-fashioned genre of entertainment, a spectacular kind of theatrical performance, a little bit like a pantomime. It usually had a simple plot featuring dance and song and allegorical characters, sometimes in masks, and it would also include supernatural beings, gods and fairies and ghosts and witches and so on. So a masque is a useful way to think of A Christmas Carol and its mixture of ghosts and human characters and magic visions. The carol uses mask-like figures to play out the contest between cold and warmth, darkness and light, solitude and community, misanthropy and sympathy. The characters are partly allegorical figures, personifications of abstract meanings or ideas. Take these 2 examples, Scrooge and his nephew Fred. Scrooge personifies chilly misanthropy. The cold within him froze his old features. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature always about with him. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. Scrooge's nephew is constructed almost as the opposite. The nephew had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled and his breath smoked again. The comparison with Dickens I mentioned earlier. Several people commented that the description of the nephew actually matched the description of Dickens as he arrived from a wintry walk. Dickens has this capacity to raise the temperature, and that's what he's after in A Christmas Carol as narrator, to raise the temperature. So these 2 characters, the nephew and Scrooge, are distilled into walking embodiments of cold and warmth. You could think of them as Scrooge the refrigerator and Fred the radiator, and the clash between these 2. These are elemental confrontations that Dickens is working with. When Dickens gave public readings of the carol, he scribbled little margin prompts to himself in the reading copy, of which we have a reproduction here. This is one of the openings of the page that he used when he was giving his public reading. And you can see on this page where he's describing Scrooge's vision of dear old Fezziwig again, his generous former employer, that Scrooge's delight starts to melt his iced up hearts. And these are Dickens's scribbled annotations here, prompts to him. Scrooge melted, melted, melted 3 times. How on earth you go about melting a Scrooge is a really difficult problem. But you could start by making him laugh, by making him cry, as Dickens wants to do with us, his readers or his listeners. So this Masque story, which we could also think of as a kind of parable, the story with a lesson using allegorical characters, the old refrigerator begins to melt bit by bit through the agency of the 3 spirits. And by the end, to continue the fridge metaphor, Scrooge saturates everyone he meets with floods of long frozen and now rapidly thawing goodwill. He himself has become fluid enough to be able to live in the past, the present and the future. You remember that strange vow that he pledged at the end of his encounter with the ghost of Christmas yet to come, promising to live in the past, the present and the future. Scrooge has opened his heart to the poor lonely boy he used to be, so he becomes rejuvenated. He opens his heart to the wider human family and will live in the future as a second father to Tiny Tim. So part 3, the final part, was Dickens right? Can literature change people's minds? If a story can so work on the imagination as to affect people's hearts, it can help to change their minds. And that was Dickens's notion. A story well told draws you into sympathy with and understanding of other people's life experiences and feelings in an imaginary world. And that, if successful, can open the way to extending sympathy and understanding in the real world. Dickens's contemporary, the novelist George Eliot, wrote on one occasion, "The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether the painter, poet or novelist, is the extension of our sympathies. The greatest benefit we owe to the artist, whether painter, poet or novelist, is the extension of our sympathies." Immersion in a novel or short story can help us to grow, to understand and feel what it's like to be someone else, to live for a while in someone else's life. Perhaps for a young person to feel what it's like to be an old person, a man to feel what it's like to be a woman to feel like what it's to be a man, a rich person to feel what it's like to be a poor person, and so on. The idea is that sympathetic engagement, imaginative engagement with fiction, opens the mind to look outwards. It's a kind of moral education at its best, which is why Dickens chose to relinquish the idea of the appeal to the people of England and change it into a story. A political pamphlet might make you understand what it's like to be poor, but can't make you feel life in poverty in a way that imaginative immersion in a story can. That's the idea anyway. I'm going to finish with 2 examples of the effect of the carol on people in Dickens's time. And these are really two individuals, but the first one has an impact on a larger community of people. Dickens gave readings of A Christmas Carol in America over the winter of 1867 to 68, a very exhausting reading tour. He gave a reading of Christmas Carol on Christmas Eve, 1867, in Boston. And people travelled from all over to come to listen to him, including one person, a Mr. Fairbanks, a Vermont industrialist owning huge factories. They go to the reading, and because there's bad weather, they stay in their apartment in Boston before returning to Vermont. And here's an account relayed by Dickens's daughter, Katie, much later on. Returning to their apartments in Boston, Mrs. Fairbanks observed that her husband was particularly silent and absorbed in thought, while his face bore an expression of unusual seriousness. She ventured some remark which he did not appear to notice. Later, as he continued to gaze into the fire, she inquired the cause of his reverie, to which he replied, "I feel that after listening to Mr. Dickens's reading of A Christmas Carol tonight, I should break the custom we have hitherto observed of opening the factory works on Christmas Day." Upon the morrow, the factories were closed. The following year, a further custom was established when not only were the works closed on Christmas Day, but each and every factory hand received the gift of a turkey. And the second witness to the power of the carol is Robert Louis Stevenson, author of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and Treasure Island. Writing to a friend, "I wonder if you've ever read Dickens's Christmas books. I've only read 2 of them yet, and I've cried my eyes out. Dear God, they are good, and I feel so good after them and would do anything to make it a little better for people. I want to go out and comfort someone. I shall give money. Oh, what a jolly thing it is for a man to have written books like these books and just filled people's hearts with pity." Quite overwhelmed by that. So this was one of the driving forces behind all Dickens's writings, to make people feel better, to go out and comfort people, to recreate a community of the nation and dissolve those differences between the two nations. And the Christmas Carol is his consummate effort in doing that. And this remained his overriding concern right the way through to the end of his life. Dickens died in June 1870 at the age of 58. About 3 months before that, he had an audience with Queen Victoria, who had already admired a lot of what Dickens wrote. And she was very impressed by him during that interview, but even more impressed by the larger body of his work. And she wrote in her diary, after receiving news of his death, "Charles Dickens had a large, loving mind and the strongest sympathy with the poorer classes. His is a very great loss. He felt sure that a better feeling, a much greater union of classes take place in time. God, I pray earnestly, it may." And so I'll finish by leaving you with the Dickens Fellowship links again, and inviting you to put any questions you might have about the carol, about Dickens, about the film to us, and we will hope to answer it and look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.